Hello, I'm Milan Sharavinsky. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On today's episode, we take a closer look at what happens to Ukrainian prisoners of war held in Russian captivity. As the negotiations in Istanbul resulted in an agreement to hold a new POW exchange between Kyiv and Moscow, questions rise over Russia's preparations in this regard. Far from adhering to international humanitarian law, Russian authorities have turned prisoner exchanges into instruments of psychological warfare and propaganda. So let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Despite the different meetings and talks on seeking some sort of end to the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war itself continues unabated. Both Kyiv and Moscow have been able to make minor progress in some areas, such as prisoner exchanges, with the Ukrainian side sharing high hopes for upcoming swaps.
We agreed to exchange all for all, seriously wounded and seriously sick prisoners of war. Second category is young soldiers who are from 18 to 25 years old, all for all.
The Kremlin's approach to this matter may be blemished, however. As it turns out, Russia hasn't been exactly fair when it comes to previous prisoner swaps. Newly surfaced reports show that instead of sending captured soldiers, the Russian side has been putting forward Ukrainian citizens who have been charged with various crimes and are awaiting deportation. Their crimes are reportedly unrelated to the war itself. These individuals are being sent instead of some pretty high-profile prisoners of war that Moscow still holds, like members of the 12th Special Operations Brigade Azov. And the prisoners who do return from Russian captivity have harrowing tales to share about their mistreatment at the hands of their captors.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Russian war crimes in Ukraine have been reported on far and wide ever since the start of Moscow's invasion. The Security Service of Ukraine has recently charged a captured Russian soldier with executing 2 unarmed Ukrainian POWs. Here is more on how the Russians have been treating captured soldiers and civilians.
In 2022, the world became witness to the absolute barbarity of the invading Russian soldiers. Sites like these became dark symbols of Russian occupation. These images from Andrivka are reportedly where the Russians are said to have executed civilians or captured soldiers alike. But the extent of this cruelty goes beyond executions in fields. After liberating towns like Vovchansk, Ukrainian soldiers came across what have been deemed Russian torture chambers. Witnesses say that the Russians would kidnap civilians and drag them to these rooms to physically beat them or commit other atrocities. These cases, along with the most recent one reported by the Ukrainian Security Service, are just entries into a far, far longer list of Russian war crimes. The UN and several human rights groups have recorded dozens of cases and highlighted incidents in which Russian troops were to have received direct orders to kill surrender soldiers. In March this year, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine confirmed the rising number of executions of Ukrainian POWs by Russian forces. These killings were deemed part of a deliberate and coordinated campaign.
And now, as always, it's time to take a closer look at the issue at hand. Russia's treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war reflects a calculated strategy rooted in manipulation, dehumanization, and political leverage. In the most recent exchange, Ukraine repatriated nearly 1,000 of its citizens, many of whom were soldiers or civilians wrongly detained, while Russia returned largely non-combatants, including individuals held in deportation centers, some of whom had already completed unrelated prison sentences. The glaring exclusion of the Azov regiment, whose members surrendered in Mariupol in 2022 under official orders, is particularly disturbing. Branded as terrorists by Moscow, these Ukrainian fighters remain in custody under conditions that amount to systemic torture. Denied POW protections, they serve as political hostages, symbols of Russia's refusal to acknowledge Ukraine's sovereignty and the legitimacy of its defenders. Testimonies from returnees describe mistreatment that includes electric shocks, beatings, and prolonged unlawful detentions via renewable deportation orders. Some were offered Russian citizenship in exchange for military service, an attempt to exploit personal vulnerability for military gain. The abuse endured during transport and detention illustrates not just neglect, but active cruelty aimed at breaking identity and morale. The exchange process itself appears hastily coordinated and deeply flawed. Many returnees arrived in Ukraine without identification, housing or reintegration support. Yet, despite public disappointment over the absence of prominent POWs, these individuals embody a different form of resistance. Those who refused collaboration endured unjust captivity and returned with their dignity intact. Ultimately, Russia's handling of POWs reveals a broader disregard for humanitarian norms, where individuals are treated not as human beings, but as bargaining chips. This demands urgent international accountability, greater transparency, and stronger protections for all detainees. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Rasmus Nilsson, lecturer of Slavic and East European Studies at the University College London. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me.
So the question of POWs has recently appeared in the limelight. Generally, we should probably say that every single person returning from Russia to Ukraine, that is a win for Ukrainian society. But do you also see perhaps any problems with how Russia is actually approaching the question of prisoner exchanges today?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's a bargaining chip for them, as is anything else to do with Ukraine's welfare. I would also point out, of course, that it's not simply the return of, or potential return of POWs we have to look at. It's also their treatment while they're in Russian captivity. We know of numerous confirmed cases of people being tortured, including torture to death within Russian captivity. And obviously, when the Russians are negotiating releases, they can play on this, at least indirectly, making clear that if the Ukrainians do not agree to various demands, do not show what the Russians would consider flexibility, then not only is there the risk that Ukrainian POWs might stay in Russia, there is a clear risk that they can be severely maimed or killed. So we should absolutely be skeptical over the way Russia is handling this question, including, of course, the question also of the Ukrainian children, which have been kidnapped by Russia.
So now, according to latest reports, for example, Russia has denied the requests to free any of the members of the Azov brigade, people who were defending the Azovstal facility in Mariupol. There are about 800 of them in Russian captivity, and they are being denied official POW status, which entails, again, the problems related to their treatment. Well, you've indicated concerning torture, that is even more acute when it comes to members of Azov. So what would you say can be done in this regard? Is there a risk that Russia will simply say, no, these are terrorists, we're not going to cover them, they're not going to be covered by any exchanges of POWs, they are there to stay, and many of them might actually pay with their lives for that?
Oh, absolutely. And the risk goes, just to stress, the risk goes beyond the Azov brigade or alleged members thereof. We're also talking about, for instance, international soldiers who've gone to fight for Ukraine, so non-Ukrainians. We have seen the Russians before, the Russian authorities highlighting that these might be treated as terrorists, as illegal combatants, and therefore not as prisoners of war, and therefore not accorded, according to the Russians, not accorded the rights of POWs. Absolutely, we have to worry about it, but we've also got to, what can be done, you ask? We've got to look at what the Russians want out of this. On a number of occasions, we saw a little bit of the case with the negotiations in Turkey now. On a number of occasions, the Russians will be willing to do some swaps, even for people they have said are illegal combatants, in return for at least some Russian soldiers. Beyond that, however, I think we've got to be realistic in terms of, being the Ukrainians, but also being Western supporters for Ukraine. We've got to be realistic that while the war is ongoing, and while Russia continues, as it did yesterday, to promote maximalist terms for any sort of peace settlement or armistice, then Russia is not likely to compromise on any issue where it can't get some sort of immediate win. So I'm afraid for the time being, if we're talking about, say, fighters from the Azov brigade or the like, then we may have to be reconciled to the fact that some of them are in Russia for the longer term. Obviously, Ukrainians and Russians are negotiating behind the scenes at all times, and sometimes we have seen successful prisoner exchanges beyond what was expected. I would also say the West should continue, I mean Europe in particular, should continue putting pressure on Russia, try to target sanctions against specific parts of the Russian state, the Russian elite, to try and get over issues like this. And again, I will stress, yes, it's an issue with the Azov Brigade, but the issue of Ukrainian children as well in Russian captivity is a growing problem by the day. The longer that goes before those children can be returned to Ukraine, the bigger, obviously, their long-term issues, their long-term problems.
And I think we should highlight several issues related to prisoner exchanges as well. Like latest reports also indicate that Russia is basically drawing up these lists, and what it is doing is having Ukrainians who are non-combatants and they were held up in detention centers pending deportation, usually in connection with some petty crimes, again unrelated to military activities or warfare. And now these people are included in the exchanges instead of members of combat groups such as Azov. And now, again, it was highlighted that every single person returning to Ukraine, it is something to be happy about, but also it highlights how Russia is using this tactically, right?
Absolutely. I'm reminded of the old saying, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law, in the sense that you certainly do have people on those lists of by the Russians, alleged Ukrainian combatants who are non-combatants, and you said they may have been arrested for petty crimes. They may also have been arrested for no crime that you and I would recognize, simply for the crime, if you like, of being Ukrainian within Russian-held territory. We do see, we could see it with the bombings of Sumy now as well, and we've seen it throughout the war since 2022, or the full-scale war. We can see that Russia has no care, the Russian state has no care for civilian rights or civilian lives among Ukrainians, and arguably not so much care for civilian lives among Russians either. So obviously they're going to do this. This is an old trick. It's a trick, incidentally, that the Soviet Union on a few occasions played as well when it wanted to exchange people. But it's something the Russian state is pushing now. Now, as you indicated, assuming we are dealing here with people who are being mistreated in Russia and do want to go to Ukraine, anybody who can get out is obviously a success. But yeah, we should be very careful calling them combatants. I would also notice, just to add to what you said, I would notice the cases of Westerners who've gone to, so I'm talking Americans, people from the rest of Europe, outside Ukraine and so on, who have gone to Russia and been arrested on various, let's say, more or less opaque charges. Clearly, Russia has, on several occasions, gathered, if you like, hostages in order to exchange them for favors from, say, the US or Western Europe. This is a clear sort of tactic.
And another tactic that you've already mentioned is the kidnapping on a mass scale of Ukrainian children. Now, would you say that what Russia is doing here could either meet the definition of genocide or at least be used as evidence in a broader case concerning genocide, because we can see a deliberate attempt to deprive a part of the population of their identity. Does this actually form part of what we could describe as genocidal tactic, and coupled with the intention that was often made clear by Russian ideologues and members of the authorities as well, that they want to erase Ukrainian identity, they think Ukraine does not exist as a separate nation. Would this count as evidence, essentially?
Yes, I think it could. Obviously, I have to stress I'm not a lawyer, and this case would have to try it in the International Criminal Court or something like that. But yeah, I absolutely think it could. If we go back to original definitions, so I'm thinking from the late 40s, for instance, of what constitutes a genocide, we do have to remember, and I know many people know this, but it's worth stressing, genocide or attempted genocide does not have to mean you try to kill everybody from a given population. It means you try to destroy that population as a people. And that can, for instance, absolutely include kidnapping children. It can, for instance, absolutely include destroying the culture of that people. For me as a non-lawyer, for me as a political scientist, I think there are very clear signs here that this could constitute genocide. Again, it would have to be tried in a court of law, of course. But yeah, I think the case looks very strong indeed. That's my personal opinion.
And do you think that the same could also be said about Crimean Tatars? I'm mentioning this because Crimea has been in the spotlight for the authorities in Turkey. They repeatedly said they do not recognize the Russian control over Crimea. They say it's illegal. And they also say that they will take measures to protect the Tatar population there because of the cultural affinity. So do you think that this issue perhaps could also be brought up in the course of informal talks between Ukrainian authorities and authorities in Turkey to simply reinforce their case as subsequent stages of the peace process come and go?
I think the Turkish stance on this has been very interesting from the beginning, actually all the way back to some extent from 2014. I'm really, really glad you mentioned minorities within Ukraine as well, because yes, the situation of the Crimean Tatars has absolutely been very, very difficult since 2014. Now, it has to be said, of course, historically, not least from 1992 onwards, the Ukrainian state was not always particularly supportive of the Crimean Tatars. Having said that, after 2014, the Crimean Tatar situation within Russian-occupied Crimea has grown progressively worse. It seems to me very clear that this is a significant factor in keeping Turkey's interest in the question and keeping Turkey's interest in supporting Ukraine. It's not the only factor. The Turks have, for instance, geostrategic and military reasons for supporting the Ukrainians. And there also seems to be a reasonable sort of relationship between the Turkish leadership and the Ukrainian leadership on a personal level. But yes, the situation of the Crimean Tatars is significant. And there is a possibility, and this I can't prove, but I've got a hunch that the Crimean Tatars might have been treated even worse by Russia, with more mass imprisonments, arguably more torture, so on, since 2014, if the Turks hadn't kept an eye on them. Now, Turkey is not always a solution in this conflict, but they have done some things that were supportive to the Ukrainians, and I do think, as you indicated, that the situation of the Crimean Tatars has a lot to do with that.
Rasmus Nilsson was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Russia has proposed a 2 to 3 day ceasefire in some parts of the front line. The Russian delegation in Istanbul says that this is meant to be a chance for both sides to retrieve the bodies of fallen soldiers. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has criticized the idea.
In addition to this proposal, according to the head of the delegation, Vladimir Medinsky, Moscow also transfers 6,000 bodies of Ukrainian soldiers and officers back home. Both sides have also reportedly agreed to exchange severely wounded individuals and those under the age of 25. The total number of people involved in this swap could amount to as much as 1,000. Despite this very minor agreement, there currently is no full ceasefire or other breakthrough in sight, as talks between both sides are ongoing. The Russian delegation has also denied Ukrainian allegations that the Russian Federation has abducted thousands of Ukrainian children and forcibly deported them to Russia, Belarus and Russian-occupied territories. The ICC has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over the abductions. Official Ukrainian data says that only around 1,300 such children have been returned to Ukraine.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on US President Donald Trump to impose further sanctions on Russia should peace talks stall. For now, the Trump administration has been seen as lenient towards Russia in this regard.
Speaking at a joint summit of the Bucharest Nine and Nordic leaders in the Lithuanian capital Vilnius, Zelensky called for more decisive action from the West should talks with Moscow fail. He called on the EU to pass an 18th sanctions package in such a situation and also urged Donald Trump to impose measures that he had previously mentioned. Zelensky believes that the sanctions should target Russian oil and tankers, energy price caps, and the Russian financial sector. President Trump recently said that if Vladimir Putin was not serious about ending the war, then Washington would, quote, respond a little bit differently. He also said that he hadn't imposed new sanctions on Russia because he believes that a peace deal might be within reach.
According to reports, since the start of 2025, Russian billionaires have collectively gained $22.5 billion. Their combined wealth stands at just over $317 billion.
Despite the imposed sanctions and ongoing war in Ukraine, Russia's oligarch class seems to be doing quite well for itself. Russia's officially richest person is metals tycoon Vladimir Putin, whose net worth has risen by almost $4 billion since January. He and 21 other Russian billionaires are among the world's top 500 richest people. Only a handful of billionaires have recorded losses since the start of the year. Western sanctions against Russia over its illegal invasion of Ukraine have been targeted at Russia's oligarchs. Nonetheless, Western countries have been criticized that the sanctions are not comprehensive enough and have not done more to put pressure on Russia's billionaires. Many observers see them and their wealth as a cornerstone of Vladimir Putin's regime and a crucial part of the Russian economy.
For this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.